Hi everyone, I'm Matt Vines. I'm one of the Green Skills Program Managers with the Urban Resources Initiative. Unfortunately, we can't do our planned in-person pruning demonstration right now, but the hope is that this video serves as a good overview of an introduction to structural pruning for trees. When we talk about the objectives of pruning, we tend to bin these into three different categories: public safety, tree structure and health, and aesthetics. And the ways in which you prioritize those different types of goals will depend on the type of project you're working on and also the client that you're working with. Most commonly though, the first thing you're going to look for are anything related to public safety. Primarily that's going to be any broken or dead branches that are hanging over a house, car, or other structure where they could pose an immediate hazard. You're also going to be looking for clearance, so raising up the crown from the bottom. Any low branches like this branch here that could pose a hazard to pedestrians or cars are things that you're going to want to look at potentially taking off. A typical rule of thumb is that we want at least 6 feet of clearance over a sidewalk, at least 10 feet of clearance over a roadway. Obviously, you're not always going to be able to get 6 feet and 10 feet of clearance on your first visit to a tree. So this tree, for example, if I were limbing it up, I would probably take off this branch, but I'm not going to limb everything up to 10 feet right now because the tree just isn't big enough for that. It's important to remember that pruning is an iterative process. So we might visit this tree 5 or 6 times throughout its life cycle to achieve our overall goals. Another really important component of any pruning program is going to be looking at overall tree structure and health. And this is especially important when you're working with young trees. The idea is that if you prune for proper tree structure early on, then you're saving a lot of inputs in terms of time and financial resources and equipment down the road. The first thing that you're going to be looking at when you're looking to prune to improve a tree's structure or health is any dead, diseased, broken, or crossing branches. These are really easy to spot. They're obvious inclusions in your pruning program, and they're obvious things to remove. So on this tree, for example, this branch here is broken. This is something that immediately I'm noting in my head that I'm going to take off during this pruning visit. The rest of what we're looking at for pruning for structure and health really depends on the type of tree that you're working with. And when I say type of tree, I'm referring to two broad categories. The first one is your canopy, your shade trees. Things like your oaks, a lot of our native maples, the things that are going to grow really tall, 60, 80, 100 feet at maturity. And then the second category is your understory trees. These are a lot of your ornamentals, cherries, dogwoods, serviceberries, hornbeams, things that aren't going to grow very tall and maybe won't have the same characteristics as canopy trees would. The primary concern when we're looking at canopy trees like this red maple is pruning for a central leader. And what that means is we want our trunk, we want to have a good, strong, straight main trunk all the way to the top of this tree. What we're looking to avoid is any what we call co-dominant stems. So large branches of the same size that come from typically the same point on the trunk that are competing with one another for that main stem status. This red maple is a really good example. You can see right here, these two branches are basically the same size. This is not good for tree structure and health. This is an area for rotting and eventual breakage here. So when we prune this tree, that's going to be something that we're going to look for to correct for. We're going to select one of those branches to become our main central stem, and then we're going to prune the other one accordingly. Finally, when we're looking at smaller trees, the main thing is a lot of these smaller trees aren't going to naturally grow around a central leader. Some of them may, but by and large, a lot of your crab apples or dogwoods, think they have a lot of small stems, right? They don't really have one central strong stem, and pruning for that is going against really the growth nature of that tree. So the primary thing that you're going to be looking for is actually to open up a bit of the interior of that crown to increase airflow and allow light to penetrate into the interior. And that's really important because, as you can imagine, if it's really dark in there and wind isn't getting in there, those can be conditions that collect a lot of moisture and then promote the development of fungus and decay. I'm not going to go too much in depth on aesthetics. Really, this is a tertiary concern. you're going to be looking to improve tree structure and prune for safety first in the vast majority of any pruning projects you're going to work on. But pruning is an art and a science, right? And the aesthetics part is where a lot of the art comes in. And when we talk about aesthetics, typically you're looking at things like crown symmetry. You note on this honey locust here, the right side, my right side of this tree, there's a much higher density of branches versus the left side, there's a much lower amount of branches. So that crown is a bit unbalanced to the right. So when we're pruning here, one of the things we might want to keep in mind in doing our overall pruning program is that we're going to want to remove a couple of more things from the right side of this tree as opposed to the left side of this tree to balance it out and improve the aesthetics. Next thing we're going to talk about is the types of pruning cuts that you can make. There are three main types of cuts that you're going to encounter as you're pruning. And these are reduction cuts, removal cuts, and heading or topping cuts. First, we'll talk about removal cuts. Removal cuts are pretty simple. It means removing the entirety of the branch. So we're back at the branch on the honey locust that I talked about earlier that we'd probably want to take off to raise the crown and improve clearance. If I just wanted to take this whole branch off, cut it all the way back to the main stem here, that would be called a removal cut. I'm removing the branch in its entirety, cutting back to the parent stem. The second type of cut is called a reduction cut. Reduction cuts are typically used on branches that are very large or that make up a lot of the leaf mass of the canopy of that tree. Again, coming back to our example branch here, a reduction cut, rather than cutting all the way back to the main stem, would be cutting back to a subsidiary branch, so a branch that's coming off of the branch that I'm looking at, but is smaller than that main branch. So I would cut it back probably to this crotch right here. The idea is that you're reducing the size of this branch, and over time you're ultimately reducing the relative growth rate of that branch compared to the rest of the tree. So then I could come back maybe the next time we're doing a pruning on this tree and I could do my removal. Again, this branch is small enough that you could do that in one reduction cut, and typically you want to try and achieve your pruning goals in as few cuts as possible. The final type of cut is referred to as a heading or topping cut. Typically these are not good practice when you're pruning. You want to avoid making these types of cuts in the vast majority of cases. However, they can be used effectively in certain very specific cases. For example, if you're trying to do restoration pruning on a tree that's been heavily storm damaged and you're trying to stimulate sprouting and growth so that tree develops new leaves, then that might be a case where you use some heading or topping cuts. But essentially what a heading cut is it's a reduction cut to a subsidiary branch, so to a branch that's coming off, but that branch is too small to take on the role of then being the lead branch. When you're actually ready to cut your branch, there's going to be 3 steps to that cut. And this is whether you're doing a reduction or a removal, whatever the cut is, you're going to want to follow a 3-step approach. The first step is to remove the weight on that branch. So if I want to take this branch off here, it's much safer and it makes for a much cleaner, better final cut if I actually remove the weight first. The key is that you want to make sure that you're at least about a foot away from where you're going to do your final cut. So on here I might do a weight removal cut somewhere out here. So I'll go ahead and show you that really quick. What you want to do when you're cutting is use long, fluid motions and have yourself be set up at a 90-degree angle, so perpendicular to the branch that you're actually cutting. So as you can see, I've done my weight removal cut. That's step 1 of the branch removal process. Step 2 is making what's called an undercut. And this is very important because where you make your undercut is going to be critical. This is your final cut, right? So you don't want to mess this cut up. What we're trying to do is we're not going to cut this branch flush here. We're not going to cut it back here because, as you can see, that's going to leave a much larger wound. And something that we're doing also is we're cutting into what's called the branch collar. That's this kind of swollen area at the base of the branch. And this is a really important area of cell division and also of protection against decay. So we want to leave the branch collar intact when we're doing our final pruning cut because that's what's going to allow this tree to heal both quickly and effectively. So when you make your undercut, try and line it up with where you want your final cut to be. Remember to stay outside of the branch collar. You don't need to go too far in. Typically a good rule of thumb is doing your undercut about 1/3 of the way in. And then to do your final cut, you want to line it up with where your undercut is, again outside of the branch collar, and then cut the rest of the way down, completing your branch removal. So I finished my branch removal. I just really quickly wanted to show you an example of an earlier pruning cut and what it looks like when that cut is done well and when it starts to heal. You can see right here, we have the nub of an old branch that was down here that was pruned correctly outside of the branch collar. We're starting to have this sealing up around here, which will close this wound eventually. Again, remember that this was done outside of the branch collar, so we've got a wound that's maybe this big compared to if we had done it flush, that's this big. So compare that to that. It's about double the size, right? That's a much harder wound for this tree to heal. Not only because it's larger, but because we've also removed the actual branch collar itself and removed some of its ability to respond to that wound. Finally, and most importantly, you have to make sure you have the right equipment, regardless of what types of pruning cuts you're doing or regardless of what your objectives are. The pruning that you're going to be doing is primarily going to be done either with a folding handsaw like this one here. This is the one you saw me using earlier. Or for branches that are higher up, you're going to be using what's called a pole saw. That's what this is here. You can also use hand clippers or pruners, which you've probably seen. Those are common tools in most gardening work. Or you can use what's called a pole pruner. It's basically a cutting version of this saw. So it's got the pruner up at the tip, and again, it's for reaching things that are much higher overhead that you can't reach normally from the ground. Whenever you're pruning, absolutely critical to remember your personal protective equipment, your PPE. And this consists of a helmet, like this one here, safety goggles, like these, gloves, and then it's also a good idea, usually, especially if you're working in a public area, to wear a safety vest or some other piece of high visibility clothing so that people can always see where you are and where you're working. All right, so we're back at our red maple here. I'm geared up. I'm gonna walk you through my decision-making process here, talk about the overall pruning prescription that I'm gonna do for this tree, and then we'll show you the finished product. So, here, remember we have our broken branch. That's something that I know immediately I'm going to want to remove. However, also note that this branch here is really low. It's overhanging a lot of equipment. It's obstructing sight lines back here. And so I said earlier that making a few large cuts is always better, right? You want to achieve your goals in as few cuts as possible. So rather than cutting here and then maybe cutting out here to get rid of some of this branch, I'm probably just going to remove this entire thing. So I'll cut back to here. That's solving my clearance concern, and that's also eliminating this damaged branch here. Now remember, when we're talking about big trees, the main thing we're going to be looking at, other than dead, diseased, damage, which I don't see a ton of other dead or diseased branches on here. There's nothing else that obviously or immediately sticks out to me. So I'm moving on now to overall tree structure and health with an eye towards maintaining a dominant leader, right? So we want a central leader, a good clean central stem. Now this splits here. So I know these are my two candidates here for a leading stem. And there's not necessarily one way to do this. Two people might prune the same tree differently. My thought process here is that while this branch here is more centered, it's more upright, this branch isn't far off, and it's slightly bigger. So that's an indication to me that the tree already has been investing more resources in that branch, and it's going to be more likely to take on the role of a healthy, strong, fast-growing central leader. Also, if you notice on this branch here, the one on the right, if you travel up that branch up to the top, it's split again. So if I were to leave that as my main leader, then we've got another split up at the top between two smaller competing branches on now what would be our central stem that then I'm gonna have to worry about, and that's too high really for my equipment to reach. So now I'm gonna need a specialized team or equipment to actually make that happen. So rather than having to deal with that down the road, I'm going to have the leftmost branch be our central leader for now, and prune part of the rightmost branch, which means that I won't have to worry about that splitting down the road, because that's probably a branch that over time I'm going to do future reductions on or just remove entirely. So right now I'm doing one of my uppercuts to reduce the competing leader that we were trying to cut back in favor of the other one. And you'll notice I'm using my pole saw, again long, slow, even pulls of the saw, letting the saw do most of the work for me. Alright, so we've just finished our pruning. If you take a look at the tree, you can see that we did our limbing up at the bottom. And then if you look up towards the top, you'll notice I took out some of those interior branches on the right-hand trunk, understanding that we want to reduce that branch over time. You'll see this is all the stuff that we cut off of the tree. I've cut it down to length, which then we can put up to get mulched by the Parks Department. And this is pretty good. I think this tree is a lot better structurally now. I'm just going to, out of an abundance of caution, I didn't see any fungus or anything like that, but I'm going to clean the saw just to show you. Typically you use rubbing alcohol and a rag works great. In the absence of that, you should certainly have a first aid kit on you if you're doing any pruning work, and just a regular alcohol swab will work fine. You take the alcohol swab and you rub down the blade, especially the teeth part, the cutting part, and this rubbing alcohol will effectively sterilize that blade, so it's good to use for your next cut. Thanks, that's all I have today. I hope this was helpful, I hope it was informational, and hopefully next time we can get out there in the field together.